Hello, welcome to this Lit in 5 video on Mary Shelley's work of genius, Frankenstein. This is one of my favourite novels to read, to teach, to talk about, so I have a lot to say about this and I hope you find it useful. If ever I find myself getting a bit too big for my boots, I remember that Shelley wrote this novel when she was round about 18, 19. So if I think about what I was doing in my late teens, it sort of puts me in my place a little bit. So this is the first of two videos on language in Frankenstein. I have a lot to say about this. This being the first of those two, this will explain the 5 areas of language very shortly, which I'll be exploring in close detail over the 2 videos. Eventually, when I get the time as well, I'll also make and put up and add a context video and a structure video. Very important to consider that in how Shelley structures the novel in terms of stories within stories, framing narratives, etc. A wonderful and very effective device. So I hope you find all these comments useful. If you do, as ever, leave some comments, add some likes, share the videos around. Hopefully it'll make a massive difference to whether you're doing this for Science and Society, for the Edexcel exam board, whether you're choosing to do this for coursework, or you just want to learn a bit more about Frankenstein, which is very well worth learning about. Okay, let's get into it. Onwards. Okay, so our 5 areas for language study. As I always mention at this stage, and I've tried to clumsily represent in these overlapping circles, these 5 areas always interrelate. So although we can look in one in isolation and we have a quote for number 2, the quote for number 2 can easily speak to something in number 4 or may speak to several at the same time. So let's work our way around this very quickly. Number 1, we have the heat and light motif. Now the novel is subtitled The Modern Prometheus, so as we've gone into in the context video, the myth and the legend of Prometheus, but we're going to look at how that comes across in Shelley's brilliant novel with heat and light imagery. It doesn't always link to the idea of learning and knowledge, which brings us on to number 2, the spirit of the Enlightenment. Heat and light, particularly heat, can also, as we'll show you, speak to the idea of kindness or the lack of kindness in the novel. So if kindness is lacking, if heat and light is extinguished or not shown, then we get towards the making of a monster, or the contributive factors which go towards making monstrousness. But more of that later. Then we move around to something very AO3-led, very context-led, again, which we've spoken about in the context video. The spirit of the Enlightenment. To borrow a quote from, I think it's Monsieur Waldman, or one of Victor's other professors, I think, Monsieur Waldman perhaps. This enlightened and scientific age. But tied up within that is the idea of male egotism, which we're going to go into a lot of detail about in a moment. Within number 2, we're going to have 3 offshoot areas, which are all broken down for you very shortly. Within that are the ideas of pioneering egotism, which we'll go through in a moment, ardour and obsession, and thirdly, we're looking at some key moments in relation to the dangers of the pursuit of knowledge. After we go through number 2, this brings us very nicely around to number 3, birth and nature imagery. So essentially we have these ego-driven male pioneers looking to leave their mark on mankind, their legacy, by mastering life or death, by playing God, as we'll see very shortly. However, Mary Shelley's doing something really, really important in this part romanticist novel. Check out the context video for that. In relation to man's attempts to conquer or master nature. So she responds to that and mocks it, really, as we'll see with lots of close detailed analysis. Man's attempt to play God or create life. Essentially, the amazing power that women have had since the dawn of civilization. So very important to look at how birth and nature imagery, in two ways really, as a romanticist novel, very influenced by romanticist and pantheistic values of the sublime, sort of divine element of nature, but also from, I guess, what you'd have to say is kind of a feminist reading of the novel, which shows the dominant and superior power of female creativity. Never mind being a man tinkering around with body parts in a laboratory, the ultimate form of power and creativity on the planet, certainly on mankind level, sorry to use that sexist gendered term, resides within the womb and the fertility powers of females. These last two areas, number 4, kindness or the lack of kindness, and number 5, making monsters, I'm going to put into a part 2 video. Given the length of this video, I think I'll split those up to make them easier to find and easier to listen to and explore. Certainly number 5, making monsters, I guess I could do a 2-hour video on that, but obviously that would drive everybody crazy and would go on for too long. That is such a big part of Shelley's brilliant novel. So yeah, I'm going to move 4 and 5 across to part 2, so check that out if you think that's going to be of use to you. Moving on. Okay, first of all, let's look at the heat and light motif. Certainly keep half an eye as we go through this on the idea of nature as well. This is obviously Victor, influenced by the science of the period, of the era, with Galvani looking to reanimate dead matter. Tampering with nature, trying to steal and harness and control, I guess, the sheer power of Mother Nature, who is feminized at many points throughout the novel, and then the consequences of that. So keep half an eye on those other categories of sort of feminized nature and the idea of sort of Prometheus and the disastrous consequences of man, the male gender, but also mankind, playing with forces that are beyond our control. Playing God, if you wish. Moving on. Okay, so our first moment of heat and light motif analysis centres on the idea of Prometheus. So the idea which you've mentioned in the context video of stealing fire from the gods, meddling with forces that you are not meant to meddle with or tamper with, and the dangerous repercussions of this. Much of this has overlap with some of the other circles on the openings of Venn diagram thing as well. So the dangers of the pursuit of knowledge, you'll see it lapse into matters of kindness or the lack of kindness, particularly in relation to heat. But for the moment, let's do a kind of very broad split between light imagery to do with the acquisition of knowledge, dangerous powers, and the consequences of that, compared to heat, which we'll look at a little bit in a moment, in terms of the idea of kindness and the importance of that, if it's denied or not given within Shelley's amazing novel. So we're looking at these first quotes here in terms of the acquisition of knowledge within the period being critiqued here, which I think it is, on the whole, on balance, by Shelley, of the period of the Enlightenment. Again, check out the context video. So if we start here, we're kind of going a little bit sort of sequentially throughout the chapters, although you don't have to, of course. Early on here in letter 1, we can see Robert Walton starting his expedition, which we'll talk about later as being motivated by ego and vanity, and sort of a male pride as a pioneer. And he writes to his sister, I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate in my joy. Oh, poor Robert. Okay. But you can see I've emphasised the word glowing there, okay? So the acquisition of knowledge as this kind of boost to the male pioneering ego of the Enlightenment, more on that later, is depicted there in this kind of light imagery. Similarly, when you come round to Victor Frankenstein's narrative here, early on you can see him recall how a new light seemed to dawn upon my mind. Bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery to my father. So this is Victor as he makes inroads to the sciences and increases on that march towards being able to reanimate lifeless or dead matter. Moving into the centre as well, you can see this light imagery again, absolutely linked to this idea of male ego and vanity here with achievement. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should first, note that first, being a pioneer, break through, and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. And then you can see the quote go off into this kind of God complex, more on that later, particularly the noun species. So you can see the sort of heroic terms being used here as this kind of benefactor of mankind, in the same way, I don't know, discovering cures for polio and, electricity, the wheel, any kind of pioneer who's made a discovery. Victor is now choosing, or rather Shelley has Victor put himself into this pantheon of genius discoveries here with this light imagery. The whole point with this light imagery, of course, is setting up or foreshadowing the idea of destruction and ruin based on stealing fire from the gods and being animated or illuminated, I guess, although animated is kind of close when we come to the doppelganger stuff later, when we look at some Gothic ideas, being illuminated by this passion to explore, to pioneer and to discover. This turns disastrously wrong, largely to do with the lack of heat / kindness, which we'll talk about in a moment. So we'll talk about that on the next slide, the disastrous consequences of playing with these forces which are beyond mankind's control. But I just wanted you to look early on how they are presented in these heroic terms, only to then be depicted as catastrophic. So I used the word benefactor a minute ago, as though, Victor has left some legacy of some watershed moment in mankind's history where he can now, I'm paraphrasing Victor here, but defeat death and conquer mortality. So he's a pioneer, like in later years, I don't know, Alexander Fleming, Crick and Watson for cracking open the mysteries of DNA, all these kinds of things. So he is being presented by himself. Shelley is having Victor present himself in such terms as a benefactor, but this is clearly not the case in this novel. I just wanted to raise that before we get to this last quote here, which is from chapter 24 in the novel, very late, the last chapter, when Victor is no longer able to continue his narrative. And then we have, quote, Walton in continuation. These are the last sort of moments of Victor Frankenstein. And you'll notice here, we are still surrounded by mountains of ice, still in imminent danger of being crushed in their conflict. Superiority of nature here. The cold is excessive, and many of my unfortunate comrades have already found a grave amidst this scene of desolation. Frankenstein has daily declined in health. A feverish fire still glimmers in his eyes, but he is exhausted. So we're going to see a quote in a minute where Victor gives a rousing speech to the crew of the ship. He sort of berates them, really, for not having this sort of manly fortitude to continue pioneering when faced with dangers. I'll show you that quote in a moment. But it's sort of ebbing out now, or ebbing away, sorry, beg your pardon. This light that is sort of occupied pioneers such as Robert and Victor is starting to ebb and diminish and become dim now as Victor's life peters away in sort of ignominy, I guess. Certainly his project to be a benefactor for mankind has backfired. He has unleashed a creature which threatens the extinction of the human race, potentially. More of that when we look at man and monster inversion. But there it is, dying away. So this force, this power he has played with and toyed with, despite not being able to control and master it, is still having its sort of last moment here, its last sort of presence before it eventually ebbs away and Victor dies. Okay, so here's this last quotation here where Victor angrily sort of scolds the sailors who are with Robert, helping him on his voyage. Be careful with your use of this quotation, because not long after this in the narrative, just before Victor dies, he completely contradicts this. He tells Walton to, quote, seek happiness in tranquility and avoid ambition, even if it be only the apparently innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries. So Victor does backtrack on this, but just before that, we'll have a look at some of the language here which I'll highlight, which goes towards this idea of light being sort of possessing pioneers, taking them over and giving them this burning fire to pioneer, succeed, achieve, go where no man has gone before, to pinch a quote from Star Trek. Don't put that in your essay, for goodness sake. And look at how he sort of scolds the seamen here and their masculinity, in terms of, again, don't put this in your essay, but sort of wimping out and not having the courage to pursue this. Okay, there's some stuff I've highlighted there. Have a little look. There's maybe a pattern here you could see. Agree or disagree, by all means. The stuff in sort of rectangle-y stuff, getting towards the idea of a deity or a god. So there's that kind of elevation or deification of these pioneers. Have a look at the stuff in triangles. There's all your sort of masculine pride and egotism, I guess. Look at the stuff in red. They're sort of scolding their masculinity. Are you a man or a mouse? That kind of thing. This speech in isolation would make a great sort of half-time team talk in a sports context, I think, where for male or female sport doesn't really matter. Here, though, in this context, in Mary Shelley's novel, we're being invited to look at the destructive consequences of such vanity, pride and egotism, developed to the point where it could split atoms and has awful catastrophic repercussions of male pioneering egotism as well. Just had a little highlight there as well of that word again, benefactors of your species. This is your chance to go down in history and be part of something which shapes the course of mankind for the future. And then a few paragraphs or chapters, same chapter I think, sorry, a few paragraphs later, as he's about to die, his fire and light is extinguished. We had that quote you mentioned earlier of shun ambition, or it's kind of qualified a little bit, check or be careful of your ambition, Robert Walton. Seek it within the innocent world of science and discovery. Well, Shelley is showing that's not quite so innocent after all, is it? Moving on. So if we start to explore now the idea of man meddling with forces beyond his control, in terms of heat and light, we see this first quote here from chapter 2, in which an oak tree is utterly devastated by a stream of fire and dazzling light. The oak had disappeared and nothing remained but a blasted stump. And then just underneath that, also in chapter 2, the storm that was even then banging in the stars and ready to envelop me. So that idea of the pursuit of knowledge and trying to become a pioneer in terms of male egotism has that ability to inspirit and possess and take over pioneers of the ego, like Victor and Robert Walton. So if you look at envelop there, it's going to consume him, the bid to harness and control it. But look at the power of the forces mere old mankind is attempting to harness and control. It can just devastate an oak tree, a mighty oak tree, like that, which becomes a blasted stump. proof of the supreme power of all of this and the sort of futility or the foolishness of Victor's endeavour here. So from chapter 9, after the creature has been brought to life and neglected, not shown kindness, the trail of devastation the creature causes. So you can read this from chapter 9 here. This is the guilt Victor is starting to experience. Sleep fled from my eyes. When we come to look at in the other video, monster and man parallels and inversion. Oh look, there's Victor Frankenstein, haunted by the guilt of what he's done, physically starting to resemble the being he has brought into life, to the point where creature and creator are inseparable. That doppelganger idea. I wandered like an evil spirit. So many parallels, brilliantly achieved by Mary Shelley throughout, but that's for another video. Yet my heart overflowed with kindness and the love of virtue. I had begun life, sort of conception ideas, with benevolent intentions and thirsted. There's a little 7 deadly sins moment for that kind of gluttony, for knowledge and power, for reasons of vanity and pride, and make myself useful to fellow beings. Now all was blasted. So again, some brilliant structuring and paralleling and foreshadowing from Mary Shelley there. Just to reinforce that idea of parallels as well, this is the creature talking to Victor in chapter 20, after Victor breaks his promise of making the creature a companion. Slave, I before reasoned with you, but you have proved yourself unworthy of my condescension. Remember that I have power. You believe yourself miserable, but I can make you so wretched that the light, keeping our heat and light, warmth and kindness kind of idea going, will be hateful to you. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey. Okay, brilliant quote. And we'll use that again probably when we look at video 2 with man and monster inversion. But true to its word, the creature says that he will make the light of day hateful to Victor Frankenstein. Lo and behold, we have this. So have a little look here, please. So some fantastic ideas here in terms of light and darkness. Although the sun shone upon me, as upon the happy and gay of heart, I saw around me nothing but a dense and frightful darkness, penetrated by no light, but the glimmer of 2 eyes that glared upon me. Now you read that and you think, well, there's the kind of haunting scene of the creature, or the haunting sight of the creature. Interesting little sort of twist here. Sometimes they were the expressive eyes of Henry Clerval, languishing in death, the dark orbs nearly covered by the lids and the long black lashes that fringed them. Sometimes it was the watery, clouded eyes of the monster, as I first saw them in my chamber at Ingolstadt. Okay, interesting sort of blurring there of first the eyes and the light become a symbol of torment, and it can be Henry, Victor's late friend, or sometimes they can also be the creature as well. I think that's an interesting blurring. So a symbol of the guilt and the destruction that Victor has brought into being by being neglectful and not lavishing kindness upon its creation, but then it kind of shifts into being the actual creature who has been the murderer of so many of Victor's loved ones and friends. But consider that in terms of being barred from the light. One of the many parallels again here, Victor's being isolated and feeling the alienation and the exclusion, being the outsider, that the creature suffers before this. So interesting role reversals and parallels, doppelganger again, brilliant structuring, but being barred from actual light of kindness and inclusion and happiness, even though literally he is being bathed in sunlight. He cannot experience it. I saw around me nothing but a dense and frightful darkness penetrated by no light. If you want to be a bit gothic about this, explore the idea of the labyrinth. Okay, not the literal sort of maze, although in certain novels it is that as well. This is more an inner psychological torment. So no matter where, physically or spatially or geographically, a character roams or goes to, it's a psychological imprisonment where there is nowhere to turn and they are haunted at every step and every moment. Brilliant Gothic stuff there. A few more quick references here. Chapter 16, here's the creature speaking to his creator. Cursed, cursed creator, why did I live? Why in that instant did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly, carelessly, thoughtlessly, without thinking about consequences, bestowed? So there's that idea of Victor playing with forces that were beyond his control. When he mastered them, I guess you have to say Victor Frankenstein succeeded as a scientist, but as a nurturing figure to a life that he engendered or created, that's his epic failure and results in sort of decay and monstrousness. We move down here as well. I swear, the creature said, by the sun, the blue sky of heaven, key bit here, and by the fire of love that does burn, if you like, or that burns my heart, if you grant my prayer, I shall leave and I shall never reappear. So, as ever, we must be careful. It's Victor who labels the creature a monster. There's the politics of what you name this being. It is a creature. It is a tabula rasa. It is a blank slate until it is neglected and not shown kindness. In fact, it's shown cruelty on many occasions. Pitchforks and villagers attacking it. The horror of the de Lacys when they come to see it face to face. But that's for a different part of the different video. It does have the capacity to love. See? By the fire of love which does burn in my heart. And again, that capacity to love is denied him by his cruel creator. Now we've brought up the idea of heat as a symbolic reference towards kindness, or the lack of it. Let's have a look at these quotes. So we're moving away from a bit more light-orientated stuff now, I guess, and we are focusing on heat. Again, I'm not a scientist, the two do overlap, but yeah, trying to push towards more heat now. So this is Robert Walton in terms of finding Victor Frankenstein adrift and alone and bringing him on board. Robert Walton notes that if anyone performs an act of kindness towards him, Victor, or does him any the most trifling service, his whole countenance is lighted up, as it were, with a beam of benevolence and sweetness that I never saw equalled. So look, there's kindness, which can be shown, is shown between mankind towards each other. The problem of the monstrousness arises when Victor, having fulfilled his vanity project of mastering science and conquering nature, cannot do what human beings seem to be able to do very easily. So it's that act of cruelty and the denial of kindness which brings about our creature, which becomes our monster. Speaking of who, this is a brilliant moment here where the creature discovers fire. But how symbolic is this, and how sort of portentous is it in terms of what it means for the creature and his later character journey? So he discovers fire that someone had left. He was overcome with delight at the warmth he experienced from it. Look at him here, bless him. I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought. Be aware of Shelley behind this discovery here from the creature. How strange, I thought, that the same cause, heat and warmth and joy, should produce such opposite effects. So there's a little sort of foreshadowing, symbolic warning, I guess, that the pursuit and the desire to gain and bask, I guess, in sort of warmth, love and kindness, is only going to end in pain and destruction for the creature. I'm thinking, of course, of the de Lacys and the awful tragic outcome of that. Jumping on a little bit there, the wet wood which I had placed near the heat dried itself and became inflamed. So obviously foreshadowing there what happens with the de Lacys cottage, the empty de Lacys cottage, of course. And again, that really, really heart-rending moment, well, I think so anyway, where there was a chance of happiness and love and kindness towards the creature, but mankind cannot see beyond the superficial, cannot see beyond the exterior, and only labels in terms of what it can see externally, and then just rejects and banishes all the kindness shown by the creature previously, and which he would do again, I dare say, but that's a bit speculative. Okay, moving on. This last moment here is brilliant in terms of showing the repercussions and the consequences of this lack of kindness being shown. So this is where the creature and the de Lacys part company, and then we get, as the night advanced, a fierce wind arose and quickly dispersed the clouds. The blast, I guess, of wind tore along like a mighty avalanche and produced a kind of insanity in my spirits that burst all bounds of reason and reflection. Okay, so I think this is a key moment here in the transition from creature to monster, because nature and the lack of kindness results in all bounds of reason, the thing that supposedly separates man from the beasts, man from monster, it is destroyed here and removed. And then the creature resorts to fire. I lighted the dry branch of a tree and danced with fury around the devoted cottage. So the monster that Victor has labelled the creature as since its moment of birth and its awakening, it's become true. Okay, so the creature does revert to the monster here, in my opinion, but that's far too simplistic, isn't it? Just to jump in at this point and say, oh, he's monstrous. It ignores the process of kindness being denied, the warmth and the love of kindness, which has resulted in the monstrousness here. But that undeniably, if this was chapter 1, don't do that in your essay, and you come to the novel Frankenstein, you're seeing Frankenstein's monster behave monstrously here, aren't you? I lighted the dry branch and danced with fury. So there's the creature now taking a monstrous glee or satisfaction in the destruction of the de Lacy home. But they're only the superficial headlines, if you like. I waved my brand. It sank, and with a loud scream I fired the straw and heath and bushes which I had collected. The wind fanned the fire, and the cottage was quickly enveloped. Sound familiar, anybody? Victor, chapter 2, with the lightning and the storm, which clung to it and licked it with their forked, quite sort of devilish, sort of hell-like imagery and destroying tongues. As soon as I was convinced that no assistance could save any part of the habitation, I quitted the scene, and off he goes to the woods. Okay, so that transformation there, that decaying transformation, or transformation of decay, if you like, into monstrousness, is achieved there. The thing which the creature sought, and just above that, gave him delight at the warmth and the joy he experienced from it. The denial of that has now lapsed over into a destructive, monstrous fire of revenge, of fury as well, to quote from that little moment there. So there's your journey there in terms of heat and light, and the disastrous consequences of it, and the creature's journey into monstrousness at the monstrousness of mankind and its cruelty towards the creature. Okay, let's move along to the male ego and what I might argue or call as the spirit of the Enlightenment from these male scientific pioneers like Victor and Robert Walton. Okay, so I'd like to do a little bit of close analysis of this moment from letter one. Obviously, be careful to distinguish between letter one and chapters, which gets into Victor's and the creature's narrative, etc., etc. So this particular moment from letter one, I think, merits some close analysis and enables us to unlock some of the key ideas, which demonstrates this male egotism within the age or the spirit of the Enlightenment as Mary Shelley sees it. So a little bit from the first paragraph here, but I'm more concerned with the stuff in the second paragraph. So this letter opens with, inspirited by this wind of promise. So you have to ask the question, I guess, what is promised to people like Robert Walton, pioneering and exploring where no man has gone before? I guess the answer to that has to be greatness. The idea that Robert Walton and Victor Frankenstein and other pioneers during the Enlightenment, which we discussed in the context video, Galvani, all these kind of people breaking the boundaries, leave their legacy and their mark on the course of history. You think about any great innovator or pioneer, so Stephenson with the propulsion engine, Dr. Stephen Hawking in terms of looking at the stars, and all these kind of pioneers. Even if you did want to look at someone like Steve Jobs, someone who has made watershed moments in history in terms of technological, scientific, medical advances. This is the thing which drives Robert Walton, as we can see here. So with this idea of drive and ego and determination, let's zoom in and have a little closer look at some of the language here which Mary Shelley has Robert Walton use. So you can see here there's a reference towards enticements. So if we look in the second paragraph, these are my enticements, and they are sufficient to conquer all fear of danger or death, and to induce me to commence this laborious voyage with the joy a child feels when he embarks in a little boat with holiday mates on an expedition of discovery up his native river. And as you can see towards the end here on the screen, or by ascertaining the secret of the magnet, which, if at all possible, can only be effected by an undertaking such as mine. So we mentioned mockery earlier. I don't think Mary Shelley is dismissing the advances made by pioneers during the Enlightenment, but in her novel, many of her male characters are drawn towards it. It's no secret here. It's no coincidence, rather. We have words like enticements, and we have the reference to the secret of the magnet. We also have sort of phrases like verb phrases like induce me to commence on this voyage. So Shelley, I think, is almost saying here that men who are looking to feed their own ego or create an achievement which is tied up with vanity and egotism, they're almost drawn towards pioneering discoveries in the same way magnetism will draw metals towards it. The men almost become passive. They become these sort of passive objects pulled towards making the next big discovery. Now, this is early on, don't forget. Check out the form and structure video in terms of how and why the letters are arranged in this order. But this is Robert Walton just embarking or starting on these pioneering discoveries. When we get into the inner narratives of Victor Frankenstein, he has successfully broken the boundaries, but we see the awful, monstrous and destructive consequences to his pioneering. So please bear that in mind. We meet Robert Walton and he's full of this ardour, more on that later, and this determination to be the next big thing in science. Don't word it like that in your essay, of course. But have a little look around here at some of the language to show this idea of mockery, of the vanity underpinning this achievement here. So if you wanted to be numerical about it, look at all the first person pronouns on show here. I, my, mine, etc, etc. So, and just tucked within that is, oh yeah, mankind might benefit from it as well. So we can see here, you cannot contest the inestimable benefit which I shall confer on all mankind to the last generation by discovering, etc, 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 ending with, can only be effected or caused, if you like, by an undertaking such as mine. So mankind might benefit in some way, shape or form. More important, Mary Shelley is implying here, is the sense of achievement and the fact that Robert Walton will be the person to have discovered this. Linked to that mockery, or a further way in which that mockery is put across, are the references towards a child. We'll show you some more later in terms of Victor Frankenstein. But this laborious voyage, which is of course life-threatening and dangerous and uncharted territory, gets compared to a boy embarking in a little boat with his holiday mates on an expedition of discovery up his native river. Okay, so it's clearly a form of mockery here to show that this is just a child's sense of adventure taken to an unhealthy, obsessive degree. Victor playing with body parts is akin to, I don't know, a modern child now playing with my first chemistry kit, experimenting with no sense of the ethics or the repercussions of their dabbling, of their pioneering, just pushing the boundaries for the sake of entering the pantheon of pioneers. So let's look at the characteristics of this male Enlightenment mindset here by proving it with some of the language on show here. So I think Shelley's showing how it's a mindset dominated by superlatives and status. When I teach English language at A-level, there's a gender theorist called Deborah Tannen who argues that men are concerned with status. It's a big sweeping generalisation, as most theories tend to be. But coming back to Robert Walton here and Victor, it is absolutely true, I think, to look at the bias in Shelley's depiction of these characters in terms of being really, really concerned with superlatives and status. So let's look here. We can see that Robert Walton wants to explore a land surpassing here, which every region hitherto, so like nothing else before. He wants to look at how the features are without example. So he is the first. If moon discovery or exploration was available to Robert Walton, his ego and his ambition would be sort of pulling everyone back to make sure he was the first person to be on the moon, just to say, I am the first person who has been on the moon. Similarly here as well, you can see things like never before visited, never before imprinted by the foot of man. So to use that sort of moon analogy, it's exactly the same, one small step and all this kind of thing. I am the first person to leave an imprint in the snow of this unexplored region. So the ego and the idea of being the first is absolutely at the heart here of this male Enlightenment ego as depicted by Shelley. Speaking of superlatives and status and the be-all and the end-all and the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end, let's talk God. So already, even in letter 1, Shelley is starting to hint at the God complex. You can't get better than that in terms of superlatives and status, can you? The God complex at work or underpinning some of the vanity on display in terms of these pioneering Enlightenment male characters. I've just noticed early up on top as well here, I try in vain. So 2 meanings to that unsuccessfully, but already might be a bit of a stretch, but it's up to you. You can hear the hint of vanity and egotism at work in this. But let's talk God. So Robert says he's going to find the secret of magnetism in the North Pole, and that will bring about the inestimable benefit, I mispronounced that earlier, inestimable benefit which I shall confer on all mankind to the last generation. Now, if you look at the verb confer there, it's almost like gifts from heaven. So, I am God, I will be benevolent and kind. Kindness comes up later, of course. Towards mankind, I have given you the dehydrated noodles in a plastic pot. Go forth and enjoy my dehydrated noodles, which are very savoury and very Moorish. Okay, so Robert will discover the secret of magnetism, and he'll give it to us. He shall confer it on all of us. Thank you, kind Enlightenment Science God. Bless you, Science Enlightenment God, etc., etc. Also look at that, just following on there, to the last generation. So what Robert Walton will discover will shape the course of history, and even as mankind is about to croak it, we're down to our last 2.5 people in Grimsby or whatever, the legacy of what Robert Walton has discovered to do with magnets and metal and iron filings with magnets for experiments in science class in year 10, we shall still be, oh, thank you, Robert Walton, you gave us the secret of magnetism. Thank you, kind science God, etc., etc. So definitely that idea of becoming a deity, playing God, or certainly in a delusional sense, thinking that your achievements amount to the workings and power of the omnipotent God, whoever that may be in your faith, or lack of faith, if that's your bag. That all takes us back towards Prometheus, doesn't it? So when Prometheus stole fire from the gods, he became more than man. However, you're questioning, does that then give you godlike status? You've falsely taken or stolen the power of the gods. That doesn't quite make you a fully fledged god, does it? You're only playing with it. You're a fraud in a sense. You're on borrowed time in terms of that power. It is only leased to you, or not even leased if it's stolen, is it? It wrongly belongs to you, and dreadful consequences may ensue because of that. Just on the Prometheus thing, please note that at the start of the second paragraph, what may not be expected in a country of eternal light, and the sun is forever visible. Its broad disk just skirting the horizon, diffusing a perpetual splendour. So take that idea of perpetual splendour and vanity that we've mentioned, and all mankind will be grateful to me, to the last generation. So we'll definitely get into the idea of maybe Robert Walton wanted to be held in perpetual splendour for his legacy and the impact of his discovery on mankind until our last days. And finally, on our little introduction to much of the male mindset here of pioneering Enlightenment figures, how do you solve a problem like a feminized nature? So, as we mentioned in the context video, the Enlightenment is a period of scientific discovery, rational thought, nothing to do with hocus pocus, the imagination, the supernatural, etc., etc. The Romanticists as a movement kind of put two fingers up to all of this rational thinking, negative capability, the sublime, etc., etc. But already, even in this letter, we have the following quote here, as though nature, eventually feminized, as we'll show you in great deal very shortly, is a problem to be solved. So, if you look at the second line of this paragraph, I may discover the wondrous power which attracts the needle and may regulate, come back to that in a moment, 1,000 celestial observations that require only this voyage to render their seeming eccentricities consistent forever. So, I will take the unexplained a game which is heavily feminised and gendered, not always, but very, very frequently, by Mary Shelley. And our male here, our male Enlightenment mindset of rational thought, will explain all these problems, and it will no longer be a mystery. It will no longer be a secret. These are all words that I know I'm coming to quote later on, which I'm going to show you. And then, oh, thank goodness for that. It took Robert Walton to explain all that magnetism palaver. Oh, God, what a mystery that was, until they came along and solved that. However, the romanticist and feminist sensibilities of our amazing writer, we spoke about her parentage, we spoke about her husband, and we've gone into the influences upon her thinking in the context video, is a rebuttal towards this idea of rational thought, which everything can be explained away through science and mathematics and all these kinds of things. Don't get me wrong, I am not a scientist or a mathematician. I am nowhere near clever enough to do that, and science and maths have made amazing discoveries for us all. However, there are still things that science today cannot fully explain. So the supposed link between twins who are separate, and if one of them traps their finger in a door, the other one is 3 floors below in the same building, and they feel the sense of pain. Spontaneous combustion, that phenomena cannot yet be fully explained by science. Apparently, scientists may be listening to this now and saying, I can explain this, I am Robert Walton. But you take my point. There are still things that still evade or elude description and explanation by science. That's part of what the romanticists were about. So just before we leave this letter, let's play a little game. So in your A-levels, you frequently get thrown some unseen texts. Now obviously this is a seen text, or one you're choosing to see if you're doing it for coursework. What I thought I'd do, I'd just highlight the verbs used in relation to Robert Walton here, and if you can, a bit of make-believe and pretend you've never met this character before, and you've never met this work of literature before, and you have to crack it open and make sense of it when someone's gone, there you go, write for an hour on that please, I expect A-star greatness, on you go. Just want you to try and explore or consider what's possible. It doesn't always work with verbs, of course, but I'm going to highlight to you on the screen now the verbs associated with Robert Walton by the writer. See what else you might be able to unlock. It can be inspired by something I've mentioned previously. Arguably, there are other dimensions to the character to be unlocked once I highlight these verbs to you. So they will flash up in a moment. Are there any patterns you can see? Can you pull any together in a particular semantic field? How are they lending to the description and depiction of the character? There are some differences here between passive verbs, so these being pulled or moved, compared to when he's in charge of or active in his movement or his actions. You can see some negated verbs as well. Never before visited, never before imprinted. Induce me is another passive verb, which is very, very different to active verbs like sailing. Alternatively, try it this way. Okay, let's start to pick up the pace and look at some smaller quotes in a more speedy manner. So here's our first one here. We're going to look at some quotes relating to pioneering egotism now. And our first one here is from letter 4 from Robert Walton. Sometimes I have endeavoured, a word you see repeated a lot, to discover, look at those verbs previously, what quality it is which he, Victor, possesses that elevates him so immeasurably above any other person I ever knew. So We can also see a pattern here between elevates used twice. Immeasurably, we also saw with that quote from letter 1 as well, the inestimable benefit. So beyond measuring, even though this is the age of the Enlightenment and we're looking at sort of quantifying and rational thought, numerical precision and fact, there are things here that cannot be measured in terms of the greatness of those who would be a pioneer. Similarly, in letter 1, Robert Walton again says he feels his heart glow, just starting to introduce the idea of heat and light motifs again, Galvani and Prometheus and all these kinds of ideas. I feel my heart glow with an enthusiasm which elevates me to heaven. So there's your deity or your deifying of those pioneers again. You can also bring in another form of context here, or literary or classical sort of mythology, the idea of Icarus. So Prometheus steals the fire from the gods, and we know his fate. But there's also Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, aspired to a godly height or level, and obviously the sun melts his wings, splash, ploosh, gone. Okay, so keep an idea on that sort of imagery of rising or daring to rise to a godly or higher level, and that kind of precipitates or brings about the fall. The close analysis of those two paragraphs from letter 1 brought in the idea of ego and vanity, okay? So we're seeing that with this second quote from Robert Walton. I imagine that I also might obtain a niche in the temple where the names of Homer and Shakespeare are consecrated. So this is Robert Walton talking about his attempts to study and analyse poetry, possibly even become a poet. It has obvious links towards the Shelleys, doesn't it? But he failed, so I've missed a bit of the quote out there, but he failed, and then he turned his attention towards science. You could go a bit further with this. You could almost say that Mary Shelley is showing Robert Walton and characters of his mindset. Are they really devoted to a particular field? Or does the pursuit of glory, as you can see there, and a great purpose and a sense of accomplishment, does that sort of trump or supersede the field in which they devote themselves to? So it doesn't really matter if they're great at poetry, if they're great at science, if they're great at Fortnite or Snakes and Ladders. It doesn't matter as long as that sense of achievement is realised and achieved to satisfy that ego and vanity which underpins these characters. Finally, on this slide, a super important quote from Victor Frankenstein from chapter 3. So I'm going to read this. And soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception. Bing, 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 bing. Coming back to that in a moment. One purpose. So much has been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein, speaking about himself or his own soul in the third person, usually an indication of a character's sanity. More, far more will I achieve, treading in the steps already marked, footprints in snow, unexplored regions, Robert Walton earlier. I will pioneer. Not very often the actual word itself is used, I think. So definitely use this as a quote if this suits your essay or your focus of your question. I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest superlatives, mysteries of creation. Now, there's lots to pick apart here. Let's go with the reference to one, first of all. The repetition of one thought, one conception, one purpose. I think Shelley is depicting, particularly in the mindset of Victor, an idea called monomania, or one word, okay? An unhealthy devotion or obsession to a particular task. So if you are solely focused on one thing, sometimes in life that's suitable, I don't know, your revision, your perfect eyebrows for an hour or whatever you're doing. So this, in Frankenstein, though, lapses over into something destructive and neglectful. We'll introduce some ideas from a critic later on who has some very important words to say about monomania and how Victor can only devote himself to the pursuit of this goal at the expense of and to the neglect of what is vitally important, his family, the kindness they show, and the love and the warmth, heat and light motif, they lavish upon him as he abandons and jettisons all that in favour of, I must create my niche, I must leave my mark on the world, I must, as Robert Walton says, obtain that niche or place in the temple. You go to a temple to worship, of course, so there's that sort of deification of these pioneers again. Very important here. I'll start at the bottom. I'm going to unfold to the world, says Victor, the deepest mysteries of creation. When we get onto birth and nature imagery, you will see, I will show you, so you definitely will see, how Mary Shelley undercuts, undermines, mocks, whichever word you want to use. They're all good academic words. This male's attempts to do what women can already do, and their amazing power of nature, nurture, fertility and birth. So what does Mary Shelley do? She quite frequently scatters around, inserts in these words that come from the semantic field of birth. So there we go, look, one, conception, to conceive, absolutely relates to the field of birth. So mockery all over the place to undermine this pioneer who goes to such great lengths, sadly causes such tremendous catastrophe to achieve what women are already amazingly capable of. Moving on. Next up on our pioneering egotism tour, quote here from chapter 3. This is Monsieur Waldman, and he's telling Victor how the ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. So we're getting into this deification of philosophers of natural science here. I want to zoom in closely on the language here, very sort of sexual, very sort of getting towards the idea of defiling a personified and feminized nature. They, the scientists, penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. So you'll see lots of language to do with secrecy and mystery being used towards that feminized nature. And then you have this crude, horrible verb of penetrate into the recesses of nature, how she works. So nature is clearly feminized here. And these pioneering male egotists who want to explain and tame, and do you remember Robert Walton in the first letter? He was looking to sort of master and control and conquer the mysteries and explain them all so they're no longer a mystery. We have that same sort of impulse here. Massive sense of hyperbole here. They have acquired new, almost unlimited powers. Prometheus, the modern Prometheus, heat and light, command of science. They can command the thunders of heaven, not last time I looked, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. Okay, so this is sort of glowing praise towards the Enlightenment and what it has benefited mankind. So Monsieur Waldman is obviously elevating such minds to sort of deified heights again. Moving around here, back to Robert Walton in letter 3, writing home to his sister Margaret. But success shall crown my endeavours. Look at that absolute certainty that it won't fail, and it will lead to something pioneering and uncharted and revolutionary in terms of mankind and development. Pretty much all he ends up doing is sailing into colder places and fishing a half-dead man out of the water. So in a way, his endeavour doesn't really amount to anything groundbreaking, does it? Wherefore not? Thus have I gone far, tracing a secure way over the pathless seas, and the very stars themselves being witness and testimonies of my triumph. Okay, yeah, all right, well done. The stars are applauding you, Robert. Well done, son. Again, it's a bit anticlimactic and bathetic. Yes, he's sailing into dangerous places, but triumph? Steady on there. Okay. Now, these two rhetorical questions, I think, are used very seriously, and there's no mockery here. We're getting towards the idea of monstrous consequences and monstrousness within mankind, which is definitely something we'll explore a lot. We have to. It's Frankenstein. It's one of the main things the book does. So, Robert Walton asks these two questions, or rather Mary Shelley has him ask these two questions. Why not still proceed over the untamed yet obedient element, this one in particular? What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? So, don't answer it, it's a rhetorical question, but I think the implied answer is nothing. Once man, during the period of the Enlightenment, has that ambition and determination to pioneer, to seek glory, the worrying answer to that question is nothing. His ambition and his ardour, coming up very shortly, is sharpened to the point where it can split atoms with his ambition and desire to be a pioneer. Then look at the dreadful, monstrous, apocalyptic, potentially, outcomes of that determined heart and resolved will. So, genuinely nightmarish, monstrous consequences in answering that question. Quick moment here from Victor in chapter 2, recalling sort of the development of his interests in science. There's that language associated with children again, Shelley undermining him. I was left to struggle with a child's blindness. Just want to pick up there as well the reference towards thirst. On the previous slide I mentioned an appetite for knowledge, to satiate, to satisfy and extinguish an appetite. I'll show you a couple of feeding and drinking references. You might take that towards the 7 deadly sins and the dangers of glutting, a verb the creature uses, overdoing it, monomaniacal fixation on. So an unhealthy appetite for this kind of knowledge, so a thirst for knowledge. You've got undivided attention, another little hint towards that monomaniacal obsession. And also here, wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame? So we've had mentioned there previously, same characteristics here by Robert Walton. Glory is one of the drivers of his endeavours. Moving on. And finally, on pioneering egotism, this really important quote from chapter 4 from Victor. No one can conceive, there it is again, the variety of feelings which bore me onwards, like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success. So, as we've already started to raise, here's a man trying to create life through scientific means, non-natural means. We know how it pans out and how it develops, monstrousness and death. There's Mary Shelley undermining him with one of many birth words. More to come later. Also within that, she embeds this simile, like a hurricane. So there's another reminder of the supreme power of nature. Prometheus / Victor, the modern Prometheus, is only playing with fire. He is not a god. He is playing with their tools and powers to disastrous consequences. Just a little reminder that nature is in fact supreme and belittles and dwarfs man in terms of power. That's why that like a hurricane is in there. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should first break through. There's your pioneer again, okay? I am the first to do it. No one has done this before. I am Victor Frankenstein. Give me glory, give me glory, give me glory. Then we have here, and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. Some people read that as an allusion towards the book of Genesis in the Christian faith. Genesis 1, chapter 3. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. So, playing God again, there he is, but also your nod towards Prometheus. Staying on the God note, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Notice the collective noun there, species. Not a new, I don't know, race would it be the same? I'm trying to think of a non-scientific word for it. A new kind of human, even that's still very scientific. What I'm trying to get at here very clumsily is Victor isn't really seeing it as life of human beings, a person. It's a very detached, obviously he is a scientist, scientific collective noun, in the same way we'd identify a species of butterfly in kind of Latin or something. He's not seeing them as people. Now, that brings us, as well as all these kind of God complex ideas, to a very important split and division here. Victor says, many happy and excellent natures, nature again, would owe their being to me. Okay, now, yes, you can create life through reanimated parts of corpses, etc., etc., but there's a difference here between creation, that Mary Shelley wants you to look at, and nurture and kindness. So she and we aren't saying any Tom, Dick and Harry can mock up a reanimated corpse in their garage on a Tuesday. Victor has undoubtedly done something pioneering and rather special. However, it's at the or after the point of creation where Victor Frankenstein is shown to fail disastrously. So, being created, how then does he go about making these beings happy and excellent in their nature? The answer is he doesn't. And this is where we get towards kindness and how, despite your scientific strength and ability, the very lacking and super important component of nurturing and kindness is essential if we're not going to breed and create a species of monsters. Our second offshoot of the Enlightenment and male egotism is the notion of ardour. It's spelt without a U if you're one of our American friends. It is spelt with a U if you're using the Queen's English, which is no better or worse than any other kind of English, of course. So, there's a dictionary definition of what it's all about. The etymology, the origin of the word, however, I think is significant here because it relates to the idea to burn. So, generally we're getting towards fervour, passion, a great warmth of feeling, intense devotion, enthusiasm, zeal, burning heat, etc., etc. But very important, I think, to consider it in light of heat and light motif, which we've mentioned earlier. So ardour, if you do what I do sometimes and put Control and F into an electronic version of the text, you probably get a million squillion hits with the word ardour in there. It is all over Shelley's brilliant novel. So let's have a look at some of these now. So here are some quotes here to illustrate ardour and obsession for you. I've given you these to make it less ardour to do. So hopefully you'll find these useful. So I'm going to argue here that Shelley wants us to look at the dangers and the damages and the cost to this unhealthy obsession and pursuit of learning. So Robert Walton here, top left, just to show it as a consistent thing across both the male Enlightenment figures. I have read with ardour the accounts of various voyages. Then moving around to Victor, plenty from chapter 4 here. I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardour. Okay, so there's this obsessive, unhealthy, monomaniacal pursuit of this learning. Look at the consequences. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes on the very brink of certainty I failed, yet still I clung to the hope, and on he goes. Interestingly already, which we'll talk about when we get to monstrousness, already starting to have some parallels of the doppelganger between Victor and the creature he makes. So a pale cheek and growing thin. Look at the cost it has, devoting himself maniacally to this study. Then we come around to chapter 4 again here. In the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. More stuff on that monomania there. I read with ardour those works, so full of genius and discrimination. So unhealthy pursuit of learning, moving around again. His progress was rapid. He notes, my ardour was indeed the astonishment of students, and my proficiency that of the masters. So the word vanity isn't used here, or pride or ego, those kind of things, but you can see underneath that it's implied a sense of egotism again. So, that Victor Frankenstein, isn't he clever? Oh good, they all think I'm clever. The astonishment of the students, the extent to which he pushes his learning and his knowledge. Coming around here to the bottom right hand corner, none but those who have experienced and can conceive, there it is again, of the enticements of science. Now recall Robert Walton in letter 1, the enticements again, and that metaphor, that key metaphor, something I should have mentioned earlier, of magnetic attraction. So those who wish to be a pioneer and, feed their ego and leave their mark upon mankind, they are drawn towards this stuff. They are attracted almost in an extremely passive way. It controls them. They are not in control of their learning. But in a scientific pursuit, there is continual food, 7 deadly sins, see thirst earlier, and glut elsewhere, for discovery and wonder. So that idea we mentioned on the previous slide of an excessive unhealthy appetite. This last quote here from chapter 5, starting already to get towards the idea of a cautionary tale. This is something you see in letter 4, when the half-dead Victor is warning Robert Walton away from pursuing and being drawn in by that magnetic pull of discovery and pioneering. More of that cautionary tale flavour here. I worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole monomaniacal purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardour that far exceeded moderation. So absolutely a sense of a cautionary tale and a warning here of this obsessive ardour, this monomaniacal pursuit of vanity and glory. Lastly, on ardour and obsession, another quick quote there from Robert Walton in letter 3, just to make you aware it often appears as an adverb as well, ardour. So I ardently desire to attain, so keep an eye out for that also. A quote from chapter 9 here from Victor. So the dream has faded now and the glory has been achieved, and that sense of anticlimax and the disastrous consequences of it. My abhorrence of this fiend, the creature, cannot be conceived. Ironically, you did sort of conceive it in a disastrous, non-natural, arguably male Enlightenment manner. More of the critique that Shelley is offering here. Anyway, back to ardour. When I thought of him, I gnashed my teeth. Doppelganger parallel. The creature does the same on many occasions. My eyes became inflamed. Heat and light motif, anyone? And I ardently wished to extinguish that life which I had so thoughtlessly bestowed. Okay, so obviously I've left out chapters in between there, but ardently want to do something pioneering, ardently want to do it, ardently want to do it. Don't know. I ardently wish to extinguish that life. Okay, so it's the critique of this failure on behalf of Victor, not a scientific failure. A failure as a human being, really, of empathy, love and kindness, which leads to the creature becoming regarded as a monster. It's wrong to refer to the creature as a monster or the creation as a monster. It is a creation. Get to the heart of the idea that we are not born bad or monstrous. Monsters are made. One of the many frightening ideas of this very prescient book. I just thought I'd end this section on a couple of quotes about ardour in the creature itself. So just to show how that goes from creator to created. Here's the creature trying to master reading and words, but more on this later. So there he is looking at paper signs for speech, which he understood, and I ardently longed to comprehend these also. How was that possible when I did not even understand the sounds for which they stood as signs? And over the other side here we have, this was indeed a godlike science, and I ardently desired to become acquainted with it. So this is speech, of course. So a characteristic that extends across Robert Walton, Victor Frankenstein, and later the creature. The difference, I would argue, is that the ardent desires the creature has certainly don't start with the idea of something selfish or vain. The creature starts with this idea of wanting to acquire knowledge, to fit in, to belong, to be the recipient of kindness, but obviously that degenerates from there. When we do the structure video, we'll talk about intersecting arcs of the characters. But that's not for now, so onwards. Okay, so new focus here, looking at the dangers, the awful catastrophic consequences of, and the critique of male ego-driven Enlightenment thinking within the pursuit of knowledge. So we have to start with letter 4 here, where Robert Walton meets and rescues Victor Frankenstein, and Victor Frankenstein is full of cautionary tales here towards Robert Walton when Victor learns of Walton's intentions and sees the parallel, obviously. Clever use of an Edenic illusion here from Shelley. I ardently, there it is again, hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been. So obviously getting towards the idea of the forbidden there, the taboo and transgression into areas which shouldn't be transgressed upon, breaking the rules, essentially. So that might be heroic, noble and pioneering to Robert Walton, but one who has endeavoured and tried this and the disastrous consequences of it is now warning Robert Walton against this. And then you get, I imagine you may deduce an apt moral from my tale. So we're definitely in the area of cautionary tales here from Victor Frankenstein towards Robert Walton. Here's Walton reacting to the words of Victor. Much of the imagery in the areas we've already seen here, look. So, the burning ardour of my soul, with all the fervour that warmed me. There's that idea of the sort of warmth and of the attraction of gaining that illicit, forbidden and previously undiscovered knowledge. Look at the desperation here and how little Walton values life. How gladly I would sacrifice my fortune, my existence, my every hope to the furtherance of my enterprise. So there's that monomaniacal, ego-driven endeavour, which is another key word that Shelley uses amongst her pioneering male egotists. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge. Get into sort of your Prometheus idea here as well, sort of Faustus almost as well. So many allusions and references to overreaches here, and the deadly and catastrophic repercussions of them, which I sought for the dominion, power, glory. Look at the sort of egotism on show there. I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. So there's that benefactor idea underneath all this, the benefits I can bring to mankind. Obviously we're looking at this at letter 4. Structurally, we think about things like one man's life or death for but a small price to pay. Look at the number of casualties, often, to extreme pain and agony in terms of the losses Victor Frankenstein suffers as a consequence of his lack of kindness. So it's all very well Walton hypothetically talking about one person's life. There are a slew of corpses resulting from Victor's tampering with nature and science. And of course, as we'll discuss in the second video, the fact that an unstoppable, it seems, threat to mankind is at large at the end of this novel. The creature roams free and potentially is a danger to all of mankind. These next two quotes here, Shelley is sort of maybe hinting at a Hamlet idea in terms of a poisoned chalice. Oh, unhappy man, Victor recognising someone else burdened with the desire and the ardour to pursue and find illicit knowledge. Do you share my madness? Have you drunk also of the intoxicating draught? Hear me, reveal my tale. You will dash the cup from your lips. So there's the benefit of wisdom and bitter experience, really, trying to deter and steer Robert Walton away from this monomaniacal, egomaniacal, I think it's fair to say, pursuit of knowledge. Last one here, a momentary flicker from Robert Walton where he looks at Victor and he says, he, Victor, appeared to despise himself for being the slave of passion. Maybe you could look at that as a little flicker of awareness from Robert Walton, and that, oh, maybe there is something in Victor's words I ought to heed or pay attention to. Alternatively, you could read that as, well, why on earth would you despise yourself for being the slave of such a noble, beneficial passion? So you could read that both ways. You could see that as Walton thinking, well, you know, why would you look in a negative way on such a pursuit? This is for the glory of mankind. Interesting sort of quote there. Moving on. Okay, so we're kind of moving forward by going back into Victor's story here. More of that on the structure video in terms of this sort of Chinese puzzle box structuring of a narrative within a narrative within a narrative of the brilliant novel Frankenstein. But here's Victor. Now this first quote here gives us a really interesting gendered split. There is a neat gendered divide here within Shelley's novel, where the feminine, for want of a better term, is associated with, we'll look at the focus here, the imagination, okay, the aerial creations of the poet, even though her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley was male and was a poet, and associated with nature, look, in the majestic and wondrous scenes which surrounded our Swiss homes, the sublime shapes of the mountains, change of the seasons. So that's associated with Elizabeth here, look, she busied herself. Elizabeth was of a calmer, more concentrated disposition, but with all my ardour I was capable of a more, look at that comparative adjective, privileging himself really, and his fields of study and discipline compared to the mere, I guess you've got to be sort of a bit misogynist and patriarchal here, the mere and lesser topics of poetry and nature. This obviously bites Victor back later, and the restorative sort of powers of nature to heal him from his sort of labyrinthine horror and hell is very much shown to mock and undermine Victor, particularly if it is associated with the power of the feminine. Given its restorative quality, Victor can create and make life, but he can't nurture and restore it. The feminine, as we'll see later, clearly can and does. So there's one of a good few ways in which Mary Shelley mocks and undermines this male enterprising spirit of the Enlightenment. Just a bit more from this very important quote here. Obviously we're getting very romanticist here in terms of the beauty of nature. There's a quick reference to the sublime shapes there. You could bring in a bit of Burke there if you wish. Burke if you want to research him. She found ample scope for admiration and delight. Now, in the final chapter, which I think is 24, we have that quote we've just seen earlier from Victor Frankenstein: shun ambition. So, although Victor early on here in chapter 2 is sort of pouring scorn really on admiration and delight, later on his character arc will come to realise that these are the things which mankind should take delight in, never mind this destructive pursuit of achievement and endeavour. But for now, look at this contrast here and this superiority. I delighted in investigating their causes. Okay, so there's your sort of scientific approach. The world to me was a secret. Keep an eye on this hidden language, or the language of the hidden, which I desired to divine to get to the bottom of, to the truth of. But I think with a clever little echo of divinity there, in terms of that deification. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature. Gladness akin to rapture as they were unfolded. So keep an eye on this, please. Look, secret, divine, hidden, unfolded are among the earliest sensations I can remember. Now, paralleling later on, the creature, when he gets hold of the narrative and we hear from him, the creature recalls its earliest sensations, obviously being brought back to life from composite body parts. But the parallel here, some of the earliest sensations that Victor Frankenstein can remember, is a desire to explain, to get to the root causes and mysteries of natural science and the natural world. Look at the destruction which comes from that. But massive quotes or importance there from this quotation in terms of the privileging of the so-called feminine, in terms of its creativity, a feminized nature and its power to restore and heal. Staying on that idea of unearthing the hidden, I confess that neither the structure of languages, these other fields and disciplines of study, possessed attractions for me. Look at possessed again, that inspirited. This is a zeal and an ardour which does possess, take over and control men like Walton and Frankenstein. No, it was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. So your Prometheus stuff here, your sort of Faustus for transgressive, forbidden knowledge. And whether it was the outer substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, superlatives here, sort of pinnacles. I mentioned ruined castles dangling precariously on precipices which can fall into the abyss and the ruin. So that's where that's going. The physical secrets of the world. I think we may have had this quote earlier, my apologies, but I opened it with apathy. The theory that Cornelius Agrippa demonstrates, but a new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery to my father. So there's your light and heat imagery again. I think Shelley's also mocking Victor a little bit in the sense that psychologically he's just a little boy who's always keen and eager to please his parents. Daddy, look, I have found some scientific things. So bounding with joy, and he goes and tells his father. That's quite endearing and natural in a way, but I think there's a little hint at undermining and mockery there, perhaps, from Shelley. Moving on. That childlike imagery occurs again. Victor noting here, I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, added to a student's thirst for knowledge. Keep an eye on language associated with appetite and excess, glutting and gluttony. They're obviously hinting towards the 7 deadly sins. They're usually punished in Gothic fiction, Gothic writing. On that note, look at pride and vanity here, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame, etc., etc. Now, they are noble aims, no doubt, just as people are trying to cure all sorts of illnesses now in the world, there's Victor's benevolent and noble intentions, but within that lurks the glory and the vanity and the pride, the hubris, if you want to put it in sort of tragedy terms. You can, of course, read Victor Frankenstein in terms of a tragic character, their tragic arc. They hit the heights, they have inner flaws like pride and vanity, and that leads to their peripeteia, downfall and death. So ruin and death. Put a bit of ruin in before they finally die. So that's an interesting sort of parallel there you could use, depending on what assessments you're wanting to do. Look, we're looking for the elixir of life. Monomania creeping in here. The latter soon obtained by undivided attention. So his focus on that leads to his ruin. Physically, he starts to resemble the creature because of that excessive devotion, that monomaniacal pursuit of it. So there's an interesting sort of physical, a way that Shelley can set up an interesting physical parallel. But look at the cost for Victor and then mankind. Quotes from chapter 3 here. There's another ardently for you if you wish. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. More in terms of the personal cost. Victor's sort of world shrinking and diminishing in terms of this sort of labyrinth he creates for himself through his monomania. I thought it hard to remain during my youth, cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world, etc., etc. Also, take my station among other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. So there's a little sort of reflection that of the importance of company and kindness and being amongst nature. But Victor's world starts to shrink now with this monomaniacal fixation and obsession. Bottom left here sees Victor in his laboratory, studying away and arriving at this sort of epiphany. Light so brilliant, so wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illustrated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius, that I alone, there's the key bit there, I think, should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. So there's the moment, I think, where ego and vanity is pricked and sort of brought into being. So if you look at this, should be reserved to discover. Victor, underneath that, Shelley is implying Victor is a chosen one. He has been singled out by someone or something to be the one who discovered this. And then the enormity of his sort of status and power starts to seduce him, really. Final quote from Victor here, which is from chapter 4, but sounds like something that would belong in letter 4, where Victor is trying to deter Robert Walton away from his pursuits. I will not lead you on, this is Victor to Robert, unguarded and ardent, as I was then to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge. Okay, so that could sort of stop there, but here's the sort of experience gained, so the wisdom, the true wisdom, if you like, or true knowledge gained from the pursuit of scientific knowledge and the regret, really, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. I think this quote is partly inspired by the loss of Henry Clerval, who is an interesting character as a sort of antidote, or the antithesis, a bit of both really, towards Victor Frankenstein. Clerval, got his name wrong, Henry Clerval is seen revelling in nature and able to enjoy languages and poetry and words and all these kinds of things, and I guess is the happiest, no pun intended, creature or character within the novel Frankenstein, and yet Victor's creation kills Clerval and robs Victor of a very dear and very loyal and loving friend. But there's also Victor's experience woven into that as well, isn't it? So enjoy nature. Don't aspire beyond your limits. Stay appreciative of your local native town and acknowledge your limits. Do not be the Faustian or Promethean overreacher, is the moral underneath this quote and this warning, this cautionary tale to Walton. On a similar note to man should not aspire beyond his limits and enjoy the simple pleasures of his native town, I just want to leave this quotation with you. Don't want to analyse it too much, but the key bit here for me is, if the study to which you apply yourself has the ability to weaken your affections and destroy your taste for those simple pleasures, then that study, whatever that may be, is certainly unlawful. And then through Victor, Mary Shelley talks about historical examples of pursuits of study and the disastrous and ruinous consequences it can lead to. Greece wouldn't be enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. So, massive sort of didactic writing here in terms of the very real worldly consequences, worldly and historical. In some senses, this is regarded as the first science fiction novel because reanimated stuff is brought back to life, and science fiction tends to play in the realm of what if in terms of science and developments, and that's why Frankenstein is regarded as that by some. But for all the what if of putting electricity through body parts and then a creature comes to life, here's Mary Shelley reminding you of the very real, very lived, very actually once upon a time actually happened historical consequences of monomaniacal pursuits and studies. Okay, let's leave that section and move on to nature and birth. And there we have it, part one. Hopefully it's been of some use, medium use, tremendous use. Hope so. Check out the other video, part 2, and as and when I can make them and upload them, the videos on context and structure. Thank you very much.